Pennsylvania had always harbored its share of secrets, but Samuel Thorne carried more than most. For 12 years, he'd worked his modest farm in Willow Creek Valley with methodical precision, known to his neighbors only as the quiet widower who could predict rain better than any almanac. None suspected that the same hands that so carefully tended his crops had once penned intelligence reports that helped turn the tide of the Civil War, or that his keen eyes, which now tracked the movement of seasonal storms, had once mapped Confederate troop movements across 3 states. That was about to change the day the Mason gang torched his barn, not realizing they'd just provoked the most dangerous spy the Union Army had ever produced. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn morning dawned crisp and clear over Willow Creek Valley, the kind of day that made Samuel Thorne grateful for his choice of sanctuary. From his farmhouse porch, he could observe 3 miles of road in either direction, while the ancient oak grove behind his property provided perfect cover for anyone needing to approach unseen. These weren't the thoughts he was supposed to have anymore, but 15 years of surveillance work had permanently altered how he viewed terrain. Samuel's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug as he watched Michael Fleming's wagon approach from town. The young merchant made this supply run every Thursday, regular as clockwork, which made any deviation immediately noticeable. Today, Michael was running 2 hours late, and his usually immaculate wagon showed signs of rough handling. "They stopped you again, didn't they?" Samuel asked as Michael pulled up to the house. His voice was soft, carrying just far enough to reach the wagon. Michael's usually cheerful face was drawn with worry. "3 of them this time, Mr. Thorne. Said they're collecting protection fees for all businesses operating in the valley." He hesitated. "They mentioned your farm specifically, said you'd be getting a visit soon." Samuel nodded slowly, his expression unchanging. To any observer, he appeared to be simply a concerned farmer hearing troubling news. Nobody would notice how his eyes had already catalogued the distinct boot prints in the mud near Michael's wagon, or how he'd noted the particular way one of the attackers had tied off the repaired wagon wheel. "The Mason gang's getting bolder," Michael continued, unloading Samuel's supplies. "Sheriff Crawford says his hands are tied, claims he doesn't have enough deputies to patrol the whole valley." Samuel helped unload the supplies, each movement deliberate and unhurried. "Sheriff's a good man," he replied, "but good men sometimes need help seeing the bigger picture." The comment was cryptic enough that Michael simply nodded, but there was weight behind Samuel's words that went beyond mere observation. Inside his farmhouse, behind the simple furnishings and well-worn books, Samuel maintained habits few would understand. Every window offered clear sightlines to key approaches. His seemingly random collection of farm tools included several that could serve as weapons in trained hands. Most importantly, the root cellar contained more than just preserved vegetables. Its deepest corner held a locked chest containing proof that Samuel Thorne wasn't his original name. That afternoon, Samuel observed 3 riders moving along the ridgeline above his property. Their attempt at stealth would have been adequate for most farmers, but he'd once tracked Confederate cavalry units through Virginia woodlands. He noted their positions, while apparently doing nothing more threatening than mending a fence. As evening approached, Sarah Collins from the general store rode out to warn him about the gang's threats. Like most in the valley, she saw Samuel as a gentle soul who needed protection. He accepted her concern with quiet gratitude, never letting on that he'd already identified the gang's likely camp location based on their riding patterns. "Just be careful, Mr. Thorne," Sarah urged before leaving. "These aren't men to take lightly." Samuel's smile held decades of unspoken experience. "Never wise to take anything lightly, Miss Sarah. Weather, crops, or people, everything deserves proper attention." That night, Samuel sat at his kitchen table making what appeared to be farming notes in his journal. But between the records of rainfall and crop yields, he was actually documenting the Mason gang's movements, their patterns, their strengths and weaknesses. It was like being back in Virginia, tracking rebel units, only now he was protecting a different kind of homeland. The soft glow of his lamp illuminated the pages as he wrote, his penmanship as precise as it had been when his intelligence reports helped General Grant plan his campaigns. Samuel knew the confrontation was coming. The Mason gang had been systematically targeting every profitable operation in the valley, and his farm's strategic location made it invaluable for controlling the region. Let's take a brief pause here. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's part will reveal something truly remarkable about Samuel's past. Through his window, Samuel could see the first stars appearing over the valley. Somewhere out there, the Mason gang was planning what they thought would be a simple intimidation of an aging farmer. They couldn't know they were about to challenge a man who had spent years orchestrating the downfall of Confederate intelligence networks, a man whose quiet demeanor masked one of the sharpest minds in espionage history. The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of horses. Samuel's hand paused over his journal, his keen senses alert to the slightest change in his surroundings. The game was about to begin, and despite 12 years of peaceful farming, he found himself falling easily into old patterns of thought. The Mason gang was about to learn that some quiet men are best left undisturbed. Dawn broke over Willow Creek Valley to find Samuel Thorne already at work, methodically checking his property's perimeter. To any observer, he appeared to be merely a diligent farmer examining his fences, but his keen eyes were noting far more. Fresh hoofprints in the soft earth near his north pasture told him 3 riders had passed during the night. Their pattern suggested reconnaissance rather than random passage. The Mason gang wasn't known for such careful preparation. This methodical approach concerned Samuel more than their usual brutal tactics. Someone was guiding them, someone with military experience. Sarah Collins arrived at his farm earlier than usual, her wagon loaded with supplies from the general store. Her face carried the strain of someone bearing difficult news. "Mr. Thorne," she called out, climbing down from her wagon. "They burned the miller's barn last night. Poor Thomas tried to stand up to them." Samuel's expression remained neutral, but his mind was already processing the implications. The miller's farm lay just 3 miles north, their barn visible from his property on clear days. He'd heard nothing, no commotion, no fire wagon bells. The gang had managed it quietly, professionally, another sign that things were changing. "Thomas?" he asked softly, helping Sarah unload her wagon. "Broken arm, some bruises. Dr. Matthews is with him now." Sarah hesitated. "Mr. Thorne, there was something strange. One of them, their leader, I think, he asked Thomas about you specifically, about your background, how long you've been here." Samuel nodded slightly, cataloguing this new information. "Kind of them to take an interest," he replied, his voice carrying just a hint of dry humor. But his mind was racing. If they were asking questions, they might have discovered something. 12 years was a long time to maintain a cover, and even the best false histories had loose threads if you knew where to pull. Let's pause for a moment. If this kind of story interests you, don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's part will reveal a shocking discovery about the Mason gang's true intentions. Sheriff Crawford's arrival interrupted Samuel's thoughts. The lawman's horse was lathered, suggesting a hard ride from town. "Thorne!" he called out, dismounting with the stiffness of a man who'd been in the saddle too long. "Got some news you need to hear." Samuel invited them both inside, his hospitality impeccable as always. Sarah prepared coffee, while the sheriff removed his hat, revealing a face lined with worry. Samuel noticed how the lawman's eyes darted to the windows, checking sightlines, another indicator that something had changed. "Had a visitor this morning," Crawford began, accepting the coffee. "Federal marshal, asking questions about recent gang activity in the valley. But here's the strange part. He was mighty interested in this area specifically. Your farm, the surrounding properties, said something about patterns matching incidents in other territories." Samuel's hands remained steady as he poured his own coffee, but his mind was shifting through implications. Federal attention meant the Mason gang's activities went beyond simple banditry. The methodical planning, the professional execution, the specific interest in his background, pieces were falling into place. "Showed me some reports," Crawford continued. "Similar pattern in 3 other counties. Small gangs suddenly getting organized, targeting specific areas, and always—" He paused, meeting Samuel's eyes. "Always showing particular interest. In former Union Army personnel." Sarah gasped softly, and Samuel knew what was coming. "I didn't know you served, Mr. Thorne," she said. "Never came up," Samuel replied quietly, his eyes never leaving the sheriff's face. "War's long over." "Maybe not for everyone," Crawford responded. "Marshals seem to think these gangs might be connected to something bigger, something left over from the conflict." He leaned forward. "Thorne, level with me. Is there something about your service I should know? Because if there is, now's the time to share it. I've got 3 more farms in my jurisdiction likely to get hit, and I need to know what we're really dealing with." Samuel stood slowly, walking to his window. From this position, he could see the distant ridge where he'd spotted the riders earlier. His mind worked through scenarios, calculating risks and possibilities with the same precision that had once helped him unravel Confederate intelligence operations. "Sheriff," he said finally, "what do you know about Confederate irregular units that operated in this region during the war?" Crawford's face showed confusion. "Not much. Some guerrilla activity, mostly hit-and-run raids." "And after the war," Samuel pressed, "did you ever wonder what happened to their intelligence networks, their safe houses, their supporters?" A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. Sarah looked between the 2 men, sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. Finally, Crawford spoke, his voice carrying new tension. "Thorne, just what kind of soldier were you during the war?" Samuel's slight smile held decades of secrets. "Never said I was a soldier, Sheriff." He turned from the window, his posture subtly different, showing hints of the man he'd once been. "But I think it's time we discussed why the Mason gang's real target isn't my farm. It's me." Deal. Through his kitchen window, Samuel could see dust rising from the road into town. More riders approaching. The game was escalating faster than he'd anticipated, but that wasn't necessarily a disadvantage. After all, he'd spent years teaching Confederate intelligence officers that sometimes the quickest way to lose a game was to start playing it too aggressively. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sheriff Crawford studied Samuel's face in the late morning light, seeing for the first time hints of the man beneath the farmer's quiet exterior. "Start talking, Thorne," he said softly. "What's really happening in my valley?" Samuel moved to his kitchen cabinet, reaching behind the carefully arranged preserve jars. The wooden panel at the back slid aside silently, revealing a hidden compartment. From it, he withdrew a leather folder, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. The documentation inside had helped win a war, though few knew of its existence. "In 1862, Samuel began, his voice taking on a subtle shift in cadence, "the Union Army realized it was fighting blind. Confederate intelligence networks had penetrated so deeply into our operations that we were losing battles before they began. General McClellan needed someone who could turn the tables, not just gather intelligence, but dismantle their entire network from within. Sarah leaned forward, coffee forgotten. "You were a spy." "Intelligence operative," Samuel corrected gently, spreading documents across his kitchen table. "Part of a small unit that specialized in deep cover operations. We didn't just collect information, we identified and dismantled enemy intelligence networks. By 63, we'd broken their primary operations in Virginia and Maryland. By 64, we'd pushed them back to their secondary networks in Pennsylvania. Let's take a quick break. If you're enjoying this story of secret war and justice, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's part will reveal an incredible connection between Samuel's past and the present danger. Crawford examined the documents, his eyes widening at the official seals and coded messages. "These are Confederate intelligence reports," he said. "Original documents." "Copies," Samuel corrected. "The originals helped General Grant plan his final campaigns. These were my insurance policy proof, of which Confederate agents remained active after the surrender. Men who never accepted that the war was over." Samuel's fingers traced a familiar pattern on one of the maps. "This valley wasn't chosen by accident, Sheriff. The Mason gang isn't here by chance. During the war, this region was a crucial part of Confederate intelligence operations. Safe houses, supply caches, message drops, all carefully hidden in plain sight. Most importantly, it was home to some of their most effective intelligence officers." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "The ones who never surrendered." Samuel nodded. "I spent the last 2 years of the war hunting them. Not the regular soldiers. They weren't the real threat. It was the intelligence officers, the ones who built networks that could survive the peace. Men like Colonel Marcus Mason." Crawford's head snapped up. "Mason? Like the gang leader?" "His son," Samuel confirmed. "James Mason. He was just a boy when I identified his father as one of the Confederates' master spies, when I helped shut down their operation here in Pennsylvania." His voice carried old regret. "Colonel Mason escaped the initial raid, disappeared into the chaos of the war's end. But his network, the one he'd spent years building, that ended here, in this valley." Samuel stood, moving to his window with the practiced grace of a man always aware of his surroundings. 2 months ago, I started noticing patterns. The gang's movements, their targets, their methods all matching old Confederate intelligence protocols. They weren't just causing chaos. They were reactivating old networks, testing old routes. And most importantly, they were looking for someone. "You," Crawford said. "They found out who you are." "Who I was," Samuel corrected. "Agent Samuel Porter, Union Intelligence Service, the man who destroyed the Mason network." His smile held. No humor. 12 years as Samuel Thorne, quiet farmer, and now the past catches up. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she gathered the documents. "The barn burnings, the intimidation, it's all been about drawing you out." "Partly," Samuel agreed. "But James Mason is his father's son. He's not just seeking revenge, he's trying to rebuild something. These gangs appearing in other counties, they're not random. They're coordinated, testing the old routes, reconnecting old allies. The war never ended for some of these men, it just went quiet, waiting for the right moment." Crawford stood, his hand unconsciously moving to his gun. "How many?" "Based on their movements. At least 30 men locally, probably more spread across the state, but it's not their numbers that concern me." Samuel's eyes tracked movement on the distant ridge. "It's their patience. They've spent months preparing, mapping every farm, every road, just like their fathers taught them." "So what's their real goal?" Sarah asked. Samuel's expression hardened. "The same as it was in 63. Control the intelligence routes through Pennsylvania into Maryland and Virginia. Create a network that can move men, money, and information. Undetected, Some wounds from the war never healed, Sheriff. Some men never stopped fighting. They've been waiting, planning, gathering strength. He paused, watching dust rise from another approaching rider, and now they think they've found their chance to start again. Through his window, Samuel could see the sun reaching its zenith. Somewhere out there, James Mason was positioning his men, thinking he was the hunter, but Samuel hadn't survived the war by being easy prey. The gang was about to learn that some quiet farmers knew far more about patience and strategy than any bandit could imagine. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Samuel's kitchen as Dr. Matthews arrived, bringing more than just news of Thomas Miller's condition. The physician's weathered bag contained not only medical supplies, but intelligence gathered from treating patients throughout the valley. In the war, such informal networks of information had often proved more valuable than official reports. "They're moving supplies," Matthews reported, accepting the coffee Sarah offered. "Wagner's mill has been busy all week. Wagon loads of provisions, heading up toward the old Whitaker property." His eyes met Samuel's, the kind of supplies an army might need. Samuel absorbed this information with the same quiet attention he'd once given to Confederate troop movements. "How many wagons?" "6 yesterday, 8 today, all heavily loaded." Matthews leaned forward. "And Samuel, some of the men, they're not local. Their accents, Georgia, Alabama, some from as far as Texas." Sheriff Crawford's hand tightened on his coffee cup. "They're gathering. But why here? Why now?" Samuel spread his old intelligence maps across the table, their faded ink marking locations few remembered. Because this valley hasn't changed much since the war. The old routes, the hidden paths, they're still here. During the conflict, Confederate intelligence used these mountains to move agents between Virginia and New York, a perfect corridor hidden in plain sight. Let's pause for a moment. If you're intrigued by this web of secrets and strategy, subscribe now, because tomorrow's part will reveal a shocking discovery about the true scale of the Mason gang's plans. Sarah traced the marked routes with a trembling finger. "These dates, you mapped all this during the war?" "Every path, every safe house, every contact point." Samuel's voice carried the weight of old memories. "Took 2 years to build the complete picture. By then, we understood their entire network, how they moved information, supplies, agents. That's when we struck." He paused, studying the familiar terrain. "Colonel Mason escaped, but we captured their documentation. Lists of sympathizers, supply caches, communication protocols, everything they'd built over 3 years of war." A horse whinnied outside, causing Crawford to instinctively check his weapon. Samuel noted the motion, but kept his attention on the maps. "The Mason gang isn't just targeting farms, Sheriff. They're systematically testing each piece of their father's old network. The barn burnings, their signals, letting old supporters know the system's becoming active again." Dr. Matthews pulled a small notebook from his bag. "I've been keeping track of strangers passing through, asking for treatment. Minor injuries mostly, but their questions were odd. Asking about old families, properties that haven't existed since the war." Samuel's expression showed grim satisfaction. They're checking which pieces of their network survived, which old allies might still be sympathetic. He moved to his window, checking the valley's approaches with practiced ease. "But they're making mistakes, getting impatient. James Mason may have his father's ambition, but he lacks his patience." A rider appeared on the road from town, Michael Fleming, moving faster than his usual careful pace. Samuel noted how the young merchant's wagon was lighter than normal, carrying none of his usual trade goods. "More news?" Crawford asked, as Michael hurried inside. "Telegraph from Philadelphia," Michael reported, handing a folded paper to Samuel. "Had to sweet-talk Betty at the office to get it. She's not supposed to share official communications." Samuel read the message, his expression unchanging but his posture subtly shifting. They found Thomas Jenkins. The name meant nothing to Crawford, but Sarah noticed how both Matthews and Michael tensed at its mention. Who? Former Confederate. Intelligence officer, Samuel explained. One of Colonel Mason's key lieutenants during the war. He disappeared after the surrender. Supposedly died in Texas in '68. Samuel's smile held no warmth. Except he was just arrested in Baltimore, coordinating with other former Confederate agents. The same pattern we're seeing here is appearing all along the old intelligence routes. Yodu Crawford stood, processing the implications. This is bigger than just the valley. Much bigger, Samuel agreed. James Mason isn't just seeking revenge or trying to rebuild his father's network. He's part of something larger. These gangs appearing in other counties, they're not random. They're coordinated, testing old routes, reconnecting old allies. Someone's trying to rebuild the entire Confederate intelligence network, using the chaos of these raids as cover. Michael moved to the window, his young face showing unexpected understanding. The supply wagons, the mysterious riders, the targeted attacks. They're preparing for something big. Samuel nodded slowly. James Mason is his father's son. He knows rebuilding the network isn't enough. They need a victory, something to prove the old ways still work, something to rally others to their cause. His eyes met Crawford's. That's why they're really here. Not just for revenge against me, but to prove they can still strike at the heart of Union intelligence, even after all these years. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising an approaching storm. Samuel watched dark clouds gather over the mountains, remembering other storms, other gatherings. The Mason gang was about to learn what their fathers had discovered too late, that sometimes the deadliest force isn't the one that strikes first, but the one that waits, watches, and understands exactly when to act. Evening shadows lengthened across Willow Creek Valley as James Mason himself finally made his appearance. He rode alone towards Samuel's farm, his approach deliberately casual, as if he were just another neighbor paying a social call. Samuel watched from his porch, noting how Mason's apparently relaxed posture belied the careful way his eyes scanned every approach to the house. Sheriff Crawford had withdrawn his deputies to less obvious positions, understanding that sometimes the best advantage was letting your opponent think they had the upper hand. Sarah and Dr. Matthews had reluctantly departed, though Samuel knew they would spread word throughout their network of what was coming. Mason dismounted with fluid grace, his movements showing military training that went beyond common banditry. He was younger than Samuel had expected, perhaps 30, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had grown up learning the art of warfare from masters of deception. "Mr. Thorne," Mason called out, using the false name deliberately. "Hope I'm not interrupting your evening." His accent was pure Virginia aristocracy, carefully maintained through years of hiding. "Though perhaps I should address you as Agent Porter, or do you prefer Samuel these days?" Let's take a brief pause. If this confrontation has you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's part will reveal a shocking truth about James Mason's real plans. Samuel remained seated on his porch rocker, his posture relaxed, but his mind cataloguing every detail. Mason wore expensive riding clothes, but the wear patterns showed recent hard use. The revolver on his hip was new, yet the way he carried it suggested long familiarity with weapons. "James Mason," Samuel replied, his voice carrying just far enough to reach his visitor. "You favor your mother's looks, but you have your father's way of moving. Colonel Mason always did prefer the direct approach when it suited his purposes." A flicker of surprise crossed Mason's face. "You knew my mother?" "Met her once in Richmond. Spring of '63. Your father was using her social gathering generals. Samuel's voice held no judgment, just stating facts. She was a remarkable woman. Would have been disappointed to see her son leading common bandits. Mason's practiced smile hardened slightly. We both know my men are far more than bandits, Agent Porter, just as we both know why I'm really here. He moved forward, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. You took everything from us, our cause, our dignity, our way of life. My father spent decades building a network that could have changed the course of the war. Your father built a network that sent good men to their deaths, Samuel corrected quietly. Both Union and Confederate. Intelligence work isn't meant to be a family legacy, James. It corrupts everything it touches. Says the man who spent 2 years living a lie, betraying people who trusted him. Mason's voice carried old bitterness. How many Confederate agents died because of your reports? How many families lost everything because you exposed their loyalty to our cause? Samuel finally stood, his movements unhurried. The war ended 12 years ago, James. Your father's network, his cause, they belong to history now. This valley has a chance for real peace. Don't destroy that for a vendetta. Mason laughed, the sound carrying no humor. Peace? The war never ended, Agent Porter. It just changed forms. While men like you played at being farmers, others kept the faith, maintained the old connections, waited for the right moment. His eyes gleamed with dangerous conviction. My father's network wasn't just about military intelligence. It was about preserving our way of life, about building something that could survive defeat and rise again. And the burned barns, the terrorized farmers, that's your way of rising again? Samuel's voice carried quiet challenge. Necessary messages, Mason replied, reminding people where true authority lies. The whole valley will understand soon enough. He gestured toward the distant mountains. Your former colleagues in Union intelligence think they won the war, think they destroyed networks like ours. They never understood what men like my father built. The roots, the safe houses, the loyal supporters, they're all still here, just waiting to be reactivated. Samuel watched storm clouds gathering over the mountains, remembering other storms, other confrontations. Your father taught you, well, James, but he never learned the most important lesson about intelligence work. He turned his full attention to Mason, letting his farmer's disguise fall away slightly. The best traps are the ones your opponent walks into willingly, thinking they're the hunter rather than the prey. Mason's hand drifted toward his revolver, but Samuel's calm certainty gave him pause. Is that a threat, Agent Porter? Just an observation, Samuel replied softly, from someone who spent years learning how your father's mind worked, how he planned, how he thought. He smiled slightly, how he always missed the signs that his careful plans were being turned against him. Thunder rumbled in the distance as the two men measured each other, decades of conflict distilled into this quiet confrontation on a farmhouse porch. Mason might have started this game thinking he was dealing with an aging former agent, but something in Samuel's stance made him realize he might have underestimated his opponent. We'll speak again soon, Mason said finally, turning to mount his horse. Sooner than you think, Samuel replied, his quiet words carrying clearly through the evening air. The storm's coming, James. Best be sure you know which way the wind's really blowing. Night settled over Willow Creek Valley as Samuel's kitchen became an impromptu command center. Sheriff Crawford returned with 3 of his most trusted deputies, while Dr. Matthews brought detailed maps of the surrounding properties. Sarah Collins arrived with her brother William, a former Union cavalry scout who now ran the local freight company. Each person represented a crucial piece in the complex strategy Samuel had been quietly developing for years. Mason's men are positioning themselves along the old trade routes, William reported, marking locations on the map. 4 main groups, each with about 8 riders. They're being careful, but I've got wagon drivers watching every major crossing. His finger traced lines between marked positions. They're establishing a perimeter, just like the old Confederate patrol patterns. Samuel nodded, recognizing the tactical approach. James is following his father's playbook. Colonel Mason always secured his supply lines before making any major moves. He spread out his own maps, overlaying them with William's observations, but he's missing something crucial. Sarah leaned forward, studying the marked positions. The old routes have changed. The railway line we built 3 years ago cut through 2 of their major paths. Exactly, Samuel confirmed. They're working from outdated intelligence. James thinks he's reactivating his father's network, but the valley isn't the same place it was 12 years ago, and neither are its people. Let's pause for a moment. If you're enjoying this tale of strategy and justice, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's part will reveal how Samuel's years of preparation are about to change everything. Dr. Matthews pulled out his notebook, filled with carefully documented observations. I've got 12 former Union soldiers in the valley who've already pledged support. They've been watching, keeping track of stranger movements, unusual purchases. The Mason gang thinks they're dealing with simple farmers, but these men haven't forgotten their training. Sheriff Crawford studied the gathered intelligence with growing appreciation. You've been preparing for something like this, haven't you, Samuel? All these years you weren't just farming. Samuel's slight smile carried decades of experience. Intelligence work teaches you to think ahead, Sheriff. I chose this valley for the same reasons Colonel Mason used it during the war. Perfect observation points, multiple escape routes, terrain that favors the defender who knows how to use it. He moved to his window, checking the darkness beyond. But I also chose it because I saw something in these people. Strength, resilience, and most importantly, the ability to stand together when threatened. Sarah opened her market ledger, revealing carefully coded notes hidden within routine business records. We've got every store owner, every trader in the network now. Mason's men can't make a purchase or ask a question without us knowing about it. They think they're gathering intelligence, but they're the ones being watched. What about the federal marshal? Crawford asked. Shouldn't we bring him in on this? Samuel shook his head slowly. Not yet. Mason has spent years rebuilding parts of his father's network. There are probably sympathizers in official positions. That's how they've operated so long without detection. We need to let them think they still have the advantage of secrecy. William pointed to several markings on the map. I've got men positioned here, here, and here. Former cavalry, all of them. They know how to watch without being seen. The moment Mason makes a major move, we'll know. They'll hit soon, Samuel said, his voice carrying quiet certainty. James may have his father's training, but he lacks his patience. The failed intimidation today, the gathering of forces. He's building towards something dramatic. He turned to Crawford. How many men can you trust absolutely, Sheriff? 8 deputies, all veterans, plus another dozen townsmen who've served in uniform. Crawford straightened, understanding dawning in his eyes. You're not just planning to defend, are you? You're setting a trap. Samuel's expression remained neutral, but his eyes showed grim satisfaction. James thinks he's dealing with an aging former agent and some simple farmers. That assumption is his weakness. Every move his men make, every position they take is being observed and documented. They think they're establishing control of the valley, but they're actually positioning themselves exactly where we need them. Dr. Matthews nodded in understanding, just like you did with his father's network during the war. Similar principle, Samuel agreed. The best way to dismantle an intelligence network isn't to attack it directly. You let it operate. Let it feel secure while you document every connection, every safe house, every supporter. Then, when you finally move. His voice trailed off meaningfully. Sarah studied the maps with new appreciation. The whole valley's a trap, isn't it? Has been since you first settled here. Samuel moved to his root cellar door, unlocking it with practiced ease. Come see, for yourselves, what 12 years of preparation looks like. As the group descended the stairs, they found not just preserved vegetables, but a carefully organized intelligence center. Maps, documents, and surveillance reports lined the walls, while a hidden compartment contained weapons and ammunition, all legally obtained, all carefully maintained. Tomorrow, Samuel said quietly, we start turning James Mason's own strategy against him. He wants to rebuild his father's network. Let's show him how thoroughly that network was dismantled the first time, and why some lessons from the war are best left in the past. The Mason gang launched their first major offensive just before dawn, striking simultaneously at 3 different locations across Willow Creek Valley. Their coordinated attack demonstrated the military precision Samuel had warned about, but it also revealed exactly what he had been waiting to see, their complete strategic approach. Samuel stood at his bedroom window, watching signal fires bloom on distant ridges. Each flame carried meaning, just as they had during the war, but now they served a different purpose. Every fire his allies lit drew Mason's men exactly where Samuel wanted them, following patterns they thought they understood. They've hit the Miller's place again, William Collins reported, arriving breathless on horseback. 15 riders, well armed. They're trying to secure the North Road. Samuel nodded, already moving to his root cellar. And the south approach? 8 men, just like you predicted. They're positioning themselves along Cedar Creek, using the old Confederate patrol routes. William followed Samuel down the stairs. But something's wrong. They're too confident, too open in their movements. Let's take a brief pause. If this strategic clash has captured your attention, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's part will reveal how Samuel's decade of planning is about to change everything. They're supposed to feel confident, Samuel replied, unlocking a hidden compartment. James Mason thinks he's implementing his father's tactics, but he's actually following a script we've spent years preparing for. He withdrew a packet of sealed documents. Get these to Sheriff Crawford. It's time to show the Mason gang why some lessons from the past are best left undisturbed. Throughout the valley, Samuel's carefully positioned allies began reporting movement. Dr. Matthews' network of former soldiers tracked the gang's advance from concealed positions, while Sarah's web of merchants and traders noted every supply acquisition, every conversation, every question asked by strangers. They've occupied Wagner's mill, Crawford reported, arriving with 3 deputies. Set up some kind of command post. James Mason himself is there, coordinating their movements. Samuel spread his maps across the kitchen table, marking the reported positions. Each location confirmed what he had suspected. The gang was unconsciously positioning themselves exactly where his years of preparation would prove most effective. Look at their pattern, he explained to Crawford. They're securing the high. Ground first, just like Colonel Mason taught his intelligence officers. Control the observation points, then dominate the valleys. His finger traced lines between marked positions. But they're missing crucial changes in the landscape. New roads, altered waterways, different sightlines. The valley they're trying to control doesn't exist anymore. Sarah arrived with fresh intelligence from her store. They're purchasing supplies in bulk, ammunition, preserved food, medical supplies, acting like they plan to stay. They do, Samuel confirmed. James thinks he's establishing a permanent base for rebuilding his father's network, creating a stronghold from which to expand their operations. His slight smile carried decades of strategic experience. He's following his father's exact protocol for securing new territory, the same protocol I spent years learning how to dismantle. Through his window, Samuel watched more riders moving along the ridgeline. Their attempts at stealth would have impressed most observers, but to his trained eye, they were revealing far more than they realized. Every position they took, every route they secured, fit perfectly into the strategy he had spent 12 years refining. "Your men in position?" he asked Crawford. The sheriff nodded. "Hidden in the old mine shafts, just like you suggested. They've got clear lines of sight to every major crossing. The moment Mason's men move to their secondary positions, they'll be documenting everything," Samuel finished. "Every rider, every supply cache, every communication route." He turned to William. "What about the railway station?" "Under observation. Got 3 former cavalry scouts watching it. Mason's men have been checking shipping manifests, asking about regular delivery schedules." William's expression showed growing understanding. "They're mapping out the whole valley's supply network, just as we wanted them to," Samuel replied. "Every piece of information they gather, every route they secure, brings them closer to where we need them." He paused, checking his pocket watch. "Time to move to the next phase. Sarah, send word through your network. The usual purchases, but with the variations we discussed." Sarah nodded, understanding the subtle game being played. Through carefully planned transactions and seemingly innocent conversations, they would feed Mason's intelligence gatherers exactly the information Samuel wanted them to have. Each detail would reinforce their confidence, convince them their strategy was working, while actually leading them deeper into an elaborate trap. "And if they decide to move against your farm directly?" Crawford asked, voicing the concern they all shared. Samuel's expression remained calm, but his eyes carried the quiet certainty of a man who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. "Let them come. Sometimes the best way to dismantle a network isn't to attack it. It's to let them think they're winning right until the moment they realize every move they've made was anticipated, every position they've taken was chosen for them, and every advantage they think they have is actually part of someone else's plan." As midnight approached, Samuel led Sheriff Crawford and select allies deeper into his root cellar, past the preserved vegetables and stored supplies, to a hidden door that opened onto a carefully constructed tunnel system. The passageways, supposedly dating back to Underground Railroad days, had been methodically expanded and reinforced over 12 years of patient preparation. "During the war," Samuel explained, his voice carrying quietly through the earthen corridors, "Colonel Mason used a similar system to move intelligence officers and sensitive documents. The difference is, he never fully mapped his tunnels. I've spent years making sure we know every inch of ours." Crawford's lantern illuminated walls lined with detailed maps and documents, each protected in waterproof cases. Equipment caches were positioned at strategic intervals, containing everything from medical supplies to ammunition, all legally acquired and carefully maintained. "Each tunnel connects to a different observation point," Samuel continued, leading them to a central chamber that served as a hidden command post. "We can monitor every major approach to the valley without being detected. More importantly, we can move our people without Mason's men ever knowing." Let's take a brief pause. If this revelation of hidden preparation intrigues you, subscribe now, because tomorrow's part will show how Samuel's secret network is about to change the entire game. William Collins examined the sophisticated setup with growing appreciation. The gang thinks they're establishing control of the valley's high ground, but you've already got eyes on every position they're taking. "And ears," Sarah added, indicating a complex system of speaking tubes that connected to various buildings in town. The devices, disguised as ordinary plumbing or ventilation, allowed Samuel's network to communicate without using obvious signals. Dr. Matthews studied a detailed ledger recording years of observations. Every stranger who's passed through the valley, every unusual purchase, every odd question asked. It's all documented here. You haven't just been preparing defenses, you've been gathering intelligence continuously. Samuel nodded, opening a hidden compartment to reveal more records. In my line of work, patterns matter more than individual incidents. For 12 years, I've tracked everything that didn't quite fit. Most of it was innocent, but some. He withdrew a particular file. Some showed that others were watching too, testing old routes, checking old contacts. The file contained detailed notes on various incidents over the years, mysterious riders asking about property boundaries, unexpected interest in old farm, records, strange questions about families who'd lived in the valley during the war. Viewed individually, none would raise alarm. Together they painted a picture of patient preparation by forces looking to reactivate old networks. But why maintain all this? Crawford asked, gesturing at the extensive setup. The war's been over for years. Surely you couldn't have known Mason's son would try something like this. Samuel's expression showed years of careful calculation. Intelligence work teaches you to think in terms of possibilities, Sheriff. I chose this valley not just for its strategic value, but because I knew what Colonel Mason had built here. Men like him don't just abandon networks they spent years creating. Someone would eventually try to rebuild it. Sarah examined a series of coded messages intercepted over the years. These are all in Confederate intelligence ciphers. You've been monitoring their communication attempts? Every one we could detect, Samuel confirmed. Most were harmless, old soldiers keeping in touch. But in the past year, the pattern changed. More messages, more organized. Someone was systematically reaching out to former network members. Through carefully concealed observation ports, they could see Mason's men moving in the moonlight, securing what they thought were strategic positions. Each location had been anticipated, each move documented in Samuel's detailed plans. The tunnel network extends under most of their chosen positions, William noted, studying the maps. You can move our people anywhere we need, without them ever knowing. Samuel's slight smile carried decades of strategic experience. Colonel Mason taught his intelligence officers to control the high ground, to dominate visible approaches. He never quite understood that true control often lies in what you can't see. Crawford examined the extensive preparation with new understanding. This isn't just about defending against bandits. You've created a complete counter-intelligence operation. Had to, Samuel replied quietly. The Mason gang isn't just trying to control territory. They're attempting to resurrect a sophisticated intelligence network. To fight that, we needed more than just guns and brave men. We needed our own network, built slowly, carefully, over years of patient preparation. Through the observation ports, they watched more of Mason's riders moving into position, each one unknowingly following paths that Samuel had anticipated and prepared for years ago. Their confidence was a weapon being used against them, their assumed superiority leading them precisely where Samuel's careful planning would prove most effective. Tomorrow, Samuel said, checking his pocket watch, they'll begin what they think is their major offensive. Every position they take, every route they secure, will feel like victory to them. His expression showed the quiet certainty of a man who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Let them think they're winning. Sometimes the most effective trap is the one your opponent walks into, believing they're the hunter rather than the prey. The Mason gang began their coordinated assault on Willow Creek Valley as dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of crimson. Their movements showed military precision, with riders emerging simultaneously from multiple approaches, each group moving with practiced efficiency to secure what they believed were key strategic positions. To most observers, it would have appeared a masterfully executed operation. To Samuel Thorne, watching from his carefully chosen observation point, it was exactly the response he had spent years preparing to counter. 32 riders total, William Collins reported, lowering his spyglass. Moving in 4 groups, just like you predicted. They're following the old Confederate patrol routes perfectly. Samuel nodded, noting how each group positioned themselves, exactly where his preparations would prove most effective. James Mason learned his father's tactics well, too well. He's repeating patterns that were outdated before the war ended. Through their hidden observation posts, Samuel's network tracked the gang's advance. Sarah's merchants provided a steady stream of intelligence about supply movements, while Dr. Matthew's veterans monitored each group's tactical positioning. Every piece of information confirmed that Mason's men were unconsciously following a script written years ago. Let's pause for a moment. If this strategic confrontation has captured your attention, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's part will reveal how Samuel's decade of preparation is about to turn the tables dramatically. They're moving to cut off the main roads, Sheriff Crawford observed from their concealed position, trying to isolate the valley. Just like his father would have done, Samuel confirmed. Colonel Mason always secured his supply lines first. James is following the same playbook, never realizing how thoroughly we documented and countered those tactics during the war. The gang's first direct move came at precisely the moment Samuel had anticipated. A group of riders approached his farm from the north, while others positioned themselves to control the surrounding high ground. Their coordination would have impressed most opponents, but Samuel had spent years preparing for exactly this approach. "Signal the others," he instructed, William quietly. "It's time to show them why some lessons from the past are best left undisturbed." Throughout the valley, Samuel's carefully positioned allies began implementing their practiced responses. Former Union soldiers, now respected farmers and merchants, moved with practiced efficiency to their assigned positions. Each man knew his role in the intricate plan Samuel had developed over years of patient preparation. The gang's first surprise came when they found key positions already subtly occupied. Every strategic vantage point they attempted to secure had been prepared with hidden observation posts and defensive positions, manned by veterans who understood the importance of patience and discipline. "They're realizing something's wrong," Sarah reported through their concealed communication system. "Their scouts are finding signs of preparation they didn't expect. James Mason just ordered his men to fall back to secondary positions." Samuel's slight smile carried decades of strategic experience. "Secondary positions that we've had under observation for years. Let them think they're being cautious. Every fallback position they choose takes them exactly where we want them." The gang's attempt to isolate the valley met similar carefully prepared resistance. Roads they thought would be easily controlled proved to have multiple hidden access points. Supply lines they attempted to cut had alternative routes already established. Every move they made revealed how thoroughly Samuel had anticipated and prepared for their tactics. "They're trying to establish their command post at Wagner's Mill," Crawford reported, "just like you said they would. The mill's position makes it the logical choice," Samuel explained, "if you're working from Colonel Mason's old strategic assessments. But the valley's changed since then. Every modification we've made to the landscape over the past 12 years was designed to channel their responses in specific directions." Through their observation network, they watched the gang's growing frustration as each attempted move met unexpected challenges. James Mason had planned for armed resistance, for typical defensive responses. He hadn't prepared for an opponent who had spent years subtle transforming the entire valley into an elaborate strategic trap. "Send word through Sarah's network," Samuel instructed. "It's time to implement the next phase. Let them think they're forcing us to reveal our defensive positions. Each response should reinforce their assumption that they're dealing with simple farmers organizing a basic resistance. The message spread quickly through their hidden communication channels. Throughout the valley, Samuel's allies began executing carefully choreographed responses that would appear to Mason's men as spontaneous defensive measures by concerned citizens. "They're falling for it," William observed, as the gang adjusted. Their tactics exactly as Samuel had predicted. Every move they make to counter what they think is amateur resistance actually positions them more vulnerably for what's coming. Samuel watched the unfolding operation with the quiet satisfaction of a man seeing years of patient preparation prove their worth. James Mason thought he was implementing his father's sophisticated strategies, never realizing he was actually following a carefully prepared script written by the man who had dismantled those same strategies years ago. "Now," Samuel said softly, "we show them why some quiet farmers are best left in peace." Through his network of observers, he could see Mason's men moving into their final positions, each one unknowingly playing their part in a plan 12 years in the making. The true battle for Willow Creek Valley was about to begin, and Samuel's patient preparation was about to prove that sometimes the most effective resistance comes not from force, but from years of quiet, methodical planning. The turning point in the battle for Willow Creek Valley came not with gunfire or dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet revelation of just how thoroughly Samuel had prepared for this moment. As morning sunlight filtered through the valley's mist, James Mason was about to discover that every move his gang had made was playing directly into a strategy 12 years in the making. "They've finished securing their primary positions," William reported from their hidden command post. "All 4 groups, exactly where you predicted they'd be." Samuel nodded, studying the detailed maps that showed both the gang's current positions and the carefully prepared responses his network had established years ago. "And their supply lines." "And they're completely documented," Sarah confirmed, presenting her latest intelligence. "Every purchase, every cache, every support contact they've tried to establish. Dr. Matthews' people have mapped their entire logistics network." Let's take a brief pause. If this strategic revelation has you intrigued, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's part will show how Samuel's master plan changes everything. Through their observation network, they watched James Mason conducting a final inspection of his force's positions. His confidence was evident in his bearing, believing he had successfully implemented his father's tactics to secure the valley. That confidence was about to become his greatest weakness. "Send the signal," Samuel instructed quietly. "It's time to show them what 12 years of preparation really looks like." Throughout the valley, Samuel's carefully positioned allies began implementing the next phase of his plan. The response started subtly. Small discrepancies in supply deliveries, slight changes in routine movements, carefully planned information leaks that seemed accidental but were anything but random. "They're noticing something's wrong," Crawford reported through their secure communication system. "Mason's men are reporting inconsistencies in their intelligence. Supply caches they thought were secure are coming up short. Support contacts they trusted are providing contradictory information." Samuel's slight smile carried decades of strategic experience. Colonel Mason's first rule of intelligence work: when information patterns change, you're already in trouble. He moved to the main observation post, watching Mason's men beginning to show signs of uncertainty. They're about to learn why their father's network fell apart so completely during the war. The first major crack in the gang's confidence came when they discovered their carefully established communication routes had been compromised. Messages they thought were secure were being intercepted and decoded, their movements anticipated, their plans countered before they could be fully implemented. "Just like old times," Samuel murmured, reading the latest intercepted message. "They're using the same codes Colonel Mason developed during the war. Codes we broke years ago." Sarah's network of merchants and traders began reporting increased Agitation among Mason's men. Supply requests became more urgent, security checks more frequent. Each attempt to reinforce their position only revealed more vulnerabilities in their supposedly secure network. "They're starting to realize the scale of what they're facing," William observed. "Every defensive move they make shows them another layer of preparation they hadn't anticipated." Through their hidden observation posts, they watched James Mason calling his lieutenants for an emergency meeting at Wagner's mill. The confident swagger of the morning had been replaced by tense urgency as they began to understand that their opponent was far more sophisticated than they had imagined. "Now," Samuel said quietly, "we show them the true purpose of all those detailed records we've been keeping." He opened a secure compartment, revealing files that documented not just the gang's current activities, but years of background intelligence on their organization, their supporters, and their hidden resources. "Start distributing copies to our trusted contacts in neighboring counties," he instructed Sarah. "Let's show James Mason that his father's network wasn't just dismantled during the war. It was thoroughly documented, every piece of it preserved as evidence for exactly this kind of moment." The impact of this revelation spread through the gang's ranks like a slow-burning fuse. Men who had believed they were part of a bold resurrection of the old Confederate intelligence network began to realize they were actually operating inside a carefully constructed trap, one that had been waiting patiently for years for them to walk into it. "They're trying to reorganize," Crawford reported, watching through his spyglass, "pulling back to what they think are more defensible positions." "Positions we've had under observation since they arrived," Samuel confirmed. "Let them think they're being cautious. Every fallback point they choose takes them deeper into our prepared response network." Through the valley's morning mist, they could see Mason's men beginning to move with less certainty, their former confidence replaced by growing awareness that they were dealing with something far more sophisticated than simple farmer resistance. "Your message to James Mason?" William asked, preparing to dispatch a rider. Samuel's expression showed the quiet satisfaction of a master strategist seeing years of patient preparation bear fruit. "Tell him that his father always taught that the best intelligence operators learn from the past. Perhaps it's time he understood exactly why Colonel Mason's network fell apart so completely when it faced an opponent who understood the value of patience and thorough preparation." The turning point in the battle for Willow Creek Valley wasn't marked by violence or dramatic confrontation. Instead, it came with the slow, inexorable revelation that some quiet farmers are best left undisturbed, and that true strategic mastery often lies not in force, but in years of patient, methodical preparation for exactly the right moment. The Mason gang's response to their unraveling position came with the desperate fury of men discovering they'd been outmaneuvered before they even began. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Willow Creek Valley, James Mason launched what he believed would be an overwhelming show of force, meant to regain control of a situation that had slipped beyond his grasp. 4 groups moving simultaneously, William reported from their observation post. Targeting key positions throughout the valley, they're abandoning stealth for speed and force. Samuel watched the gang's movements through his spyglass, noting how their desperate aggression revealed even more about their organization than their previous careful strategy had. They're following Colonel Mason's contingency protocols. When primary strategies fail, switch to overwhelming force at multiple points. Through their hidden network, reports flowed in of the gang's attacks. They struck at farms, merchant stations, and key crossroads, their actions designed to demonstrate power and rebuild their shaken confidence. But each assault revealed more of their resources, their methods, and their weaknesses. Let's pause. For a moment, If this clash of strategy and force has captured your attention, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's part will reveal how Samuel turns their desperate attacks against them. "They're hitting harder than expected," Crawford reported, his voice tense as he catalogued the gang's movements. "Thompson's barn is burning. They've occupied the crossroads at Miller's Creek." Samuel remained calm, studying his maps where each of the gang's attacks had been anticipated and prepared for years in advance. "How many men at Miller's Creek?" "8 riders, heavily armed," Sarah answered through their communication system. "But William's people are already in position, documenting everything, every face, every weapon, every tactic they use." This was the moment Samuel had prepared for, when desperation would drive his opponents to reveal their full capabilities. Each aggressive move the gang made exposed more of their organization, their resources, and their connections. His network of observers recorded everything, building an overwhelming body of evidence that would prove crucial in the coming days. "They're trying to cut off access to the railway station," Dr. Matthews reported, "setting up roadblocks, checking everyone who passes." "Let them," Samuel instructed. "Every man they position, every supply line they try to control just adds to our documentation. Their show of force isn't just failing, it's giving us exactly what we need to dismantle their entire organization." James Mason's next move proved exactly how deeply he'd fallen into Samuel's trap. The gang leader ordered a direct assault on the sheriff's office, attempting to demonstrate his control over local law enforcement. But the attack revealed something crucial about their organization. "Those aren't just local men," Crawford observed, watching through his spyglass. "Some of those riders are from out of state, different equipment, different tactics." Samuel nodded, adding another piece to his carefully constructed puzzle. "They've called in reinforcements from other parts of their network, just documented connections to at least 3 other territories." His slight smile carried decades of strategic satisfaction. James is repeating his father's mistakes. When pressured, he's revealing the full extent of his organization. Through their observation network, they watched the gang's increasingly frustrated attempts to regain control. Each show of force, meant to intimidate, actually served Samuel's larger strategy. His allies documented everything: the weapons they carried, the tactics they employed, the support infrastructure they revealed. "They're preparing for something bigger," William warned, noting changes in the gang's movements. "Gathering men and supplies at Wagner's mill. Looks like they're planning a major operation." "Of course they are," Samuel replied calmly. James Mason's pride won't let him accept that he's being outmaneuvered by farmers and townspeople. He needs to prove his father's methods still work. He moved to the main planning table, where his years of preparation were laid out in careful detail. "Let them gather. Every man they bring in, every resource they commit, just makes our documentation more complete." Sarah's network reported increased activity throughout the valley. The gang's attempts to demonstrate power had shifted from strategic calculation to emotional response. They struck at targets seemingly at random, but each attack fit a pattern Samuel had anticipated years ago. "They're getting careless," Crawford observed, "making mistakes they wouldn't have made before." "Desperation does that," Samuel explained. "They know something's wrong, but they can't see the full scope of what they're facing. Every aggressive move they make trying to regain control actually positions them more vulnerably for what's coming." Through the afternoon, they watched the gang's mounting frustration manifest in increasingly bold actions. Each show of force, each attempt to demonstrate power, played directly into Samuel's carefully laid plans. His network recorded everything, building an insurmountable body of evidence that would prove crucial in the final phase of his strategy. "Your message for James Mason?" William asked, preparing to send another carefully crafted communication. Samuel's expression showed the quiet certainty of a man seeing years of patient preparation bear fruit. Tell him that his father always said force is the last resort of men who've run out of strategy. Perhaps it's time he understood why Colonel Mason's final desperate attacks only served to seal his organization's fate. As evening approached, the valley seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how the gang's mounting desperation would manifest. But Samuel knew that each aggressive move they made brought them closer to the moment when they would realize that their shows of force weren't demonstrating power, they were documenting their own downfall. As night fell over Willow Creek Valley, Samuel gathered his closest allies in the hidden command center beneath his farm. The time had come to reveal the full scope of what 12 years of patient preparation had accomplished. Spread across the planning table were not just maps and current intelligence reports, but documentation that stretched back to the original Civil War operations. "What you're about to see," Samuel began, unlocking a hidden compartment, "is why James Mason's attempts to rebuild his father's network were doomed before they began. He withdrew a series of leather-bound journals, their pages filled with meticulous observations. These contain every piece of the original Confederate intelligence network in this region and every attempt to resurrect it since the war. Sheriff, Crawford examined the detailed records with growing amazement. These dates, you've been tracking their movements for years, long before the Mason gang appeared. Had to," Samuel replied, his voice carrying the weight of long preparation. Colonel Mason's network wasn't just about military intelligence. It was a sophisticated system for moving information, supplies, and agents across state lines. The kind of system that doesn't just disappear when a war ends. Let's take a brief pause. If these revelations have captured your interest, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's part will show how Samuel's decades of patience are about to change everything. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she read through the documentation. All those quiet years, those careful observations. You were building a case that no one could deny or dismiss. More than that, Samuel explained, revealing another set of records. Every time they tested old routes, checked old contacts, I documented it. Every seemingly innocent inquiry about property boundaries, every unusual purchase pattern. It all painted a picture of patient preparation by forces looking to rebuild something they should have left in the past. Through their observation, network reports continued flowing in of the Mason gang's increasingly desperate activities. But now, with the full scope of Samuel's documentation laid bare, each aggressive move they made added another piece to an overwhelming body of evidence. "Look at these patterns," William noted, comparing current gang movements to Samuel's historical records. They're not just using their father's tactics, they're trying to reconnect with the same families, the same properties that were part of the original network. Dr. Matthews studied a particular set of documents with professional interest. You've traced financial connections, supply routes, communication patterns. This isn't just about local banditry. This proves coordination across multiple states. Exactly, Samuel confirmed. James Mason isn't just leading a gang, he's attempting to resurrect an entire infrastructure that once supported Confederate intelligence operations. The barn burnings, the intimidation, it's all been about re-establishing control over key territories and routes. Crawford's expression hardened as he grasped the implications. That's why they targeted specific properties, why they asked such particular questions about old families and boundaries. They were mapping out the old network, piece by piece, and documenting their own crimes in the process, Samuel added, showing another set of records. Every act of intimidation, every attempt to coerce cooperation, every connection to other territories, it's all here, verified and cross-referenced. Through their hidden observation posts, they could see continued activity at Wagner's Mill as the gang prepared for what they thought would be their decisive move. But Samuel's expression showed only quiet satisfaction as he watched their movements. "They still think they're dealing with a local problem," Sarah observed. "They have no idea of the true scope of what you've built." That was essential, Samuel explained, revealing yet another layer of documentation. Colonel Mason's greatest weakness was his pride, his belief that no one could match his strategic sophistication. James inherited that same blind spot. He thinks he's implementing his father's masterful techniques, never realizing he's actually following a script written by the man who dismantled those techniques years ago. William studied the latest intelligence reports with growing understanding. Every aggressive move they make thinking they're demonstrating power actually strengthens your case against them. The more they try to prove their control, the more thoroughly they document their own crimes, Samuel finished. Pride and desperation are a dangerous combination. They're about to learn why some lessons from the past are best left undisturbed. Dr. Matthews examined records of similar patterns in other territories. "This is bigger than just Willow Creek Valley, isn't it? The evidence you've gathered here could expose operations across multiple states." Samuel nodded slowly, revealing one final set of documents. "What's happening here isn't isolated. Similar networks are being tested and reactivated in other regions." James Mason thought he was rebuilding his father's legacy. Instead, he's helped us document something far larger, a coordinated attempt to resurrect infrastructure that should have died with the Confederacy. As midnight approached, the valley held its breath, waiting for the gang's next move. But Samuel knew that every action they took now, every desperate attempt to regain control, only served to strengthen the case he'd spent 12 years building. The quiet farmer's patient preparation was about to reveal its true purpose, not just in ending the Mason gang's reign of terror, but in exposing and dismantling something far more insidious that had survived in the shadows since the Civil War's end. Dawn broke over Willow Creek Valley to find the Mason gang's position unraveling faster than even Samuel had anticipated. Through the night, his carefully placed network had begun implementing the final phase of his strategy, and the results were devastating. Not with violence or confrontation, but with the methodical exposure of 12 years of gathered evidence. "Reports coming in from 3 counties, William announced, rushing into the command center with fresh dispatches. "Local authorities are moving on identified gang positions. Every safe house, every supply cache you documented, they're all being exposed simultaneously." Samuel studied the incoming reports with quiet satisfaction, and their response. "Exactly as you predicted," Sarah added, monitoring messages through their communication network. "They're trying to warn their outlying positions, using the old Confederate signals. Every attempt at contact just reveals more of their organization." Let's pause for a moment. If this strategic unraveling has captured your attention, subscribe now, because tomorrow's part will show how Samuel's master plan reaches its devastating conclusion. Through their observation posts they watched, panic spreading through the gang's ranks. James Mason had gathered his lieutenants at Wagner's Mill, their confident swagger replaced by urgent discussion as reports of coordinated law enforcement action poured in from across the region. "They're realizing the scope of what they're facing," Crawford observed, studying the mill through his spyglass. "Every escape route they try to access, every hidden resource they attempt to reach, it's all been compromised." Samuel nodded, spreading his latest documentation across the planning table. "Colonel Mason's first rule of intelligence work: when you lose control of your information, you've already lost the war." He traced lines between marked positions on his maps. "Every move they make now only serves to verify our evidence." Dr. Matthews arrived with fresh intelligence from his network of observers, got word from contacts in Maryland and Virginia. Similar organizations there are being exposed, their connections to the Mason gang fully documented. The whole network's coming apart. Because they finally made the mistake we've been waiting for, Samuel explained. Their show of force here wasn't just about controlling the valley. It was meant to demonstrate to other remnants of the old Confederate network that they could operate openly again. Instead, they've helped us expose every connection, every supporter, every piece of infrastructure they've tried to preserve since the war. Through their hidden communication system, reports continued flowing in of the gang's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control. But each action they took, each resource they tried to access, only confirmed the extensive documentation Samuel had gathered over years of patient observation. "Latest dispatch from the federal marshal," Crawford reported, holding up a telegram. "They're moving on identified gang positions in 4 states. Your evidence is triggering the largest coordinated law enforcement action since the war." Sarah's network of merchants and traders reported increasing chaos among the gang's supporters. Their supply lines are collapsing. Every contact they reach out to is either being arrested or turning evidence to save themselves. Samuel watched the unfolding events with the quiet satisfaction of a master strategist seeing years of preparation bear fruit. James Mason made the same mistake his father did, assuming that power comes from force rather than patience. He never understood that true strategic victory often lies in letting your opponent believe they're winning until the moment they realize they've lost everything. Through their observation network, they could see the gang's positions throughout the valley becoming increasingly untenable. Men who had arrived full of confidence and aggression now moved with the uncertain tension of those realizing they'd walked into a trap years in the making. "They're trying to destroy evidence," William reported from his latest observation post. "Burning documents, breaking up weapons caches, but it's too late." "Far too late," Samuel agreed. "Every piece of evidence they're trying to destroy has been documented for years. Their very attempts to hide their tracks only confirm the accuracy of our documentation." The critical moment came when James Mason himself finally understood the true scope of what he was facing. Through their observation posts, they watched him reading dispatches with increasing desperation, his father's confident strategic legacy crumbling around him. "He's ordering a full withdrawal," Crawford announced, intercepting the gang's frantic communications, trying to salvage what he can of their organization. Samuel's slight smile carried decades of strategic satisfaction. "Let them run. Every escape route they take, every safe house they try to reach, it's all been documented. They're not escaping. They're just confirming the extent of their network for us." As morning light filled the valley, the true scope of Samuel's strategy became clear. The Mason gang's attempt to resurrect the old Confederate intelligence network hadn't just failed. It had exposed every surviving piece of infrastructure they'd tried to preserve since the war. 12 years of patient preparation had created not just a trap for local bandits, but a mechanism for dismantling something far more insidious that had survived in the shadows since the Civil War's end. The final confrontation came as storm. Clouds gathered over Willow Creek Valley, nature itself providing a fitting backdrop for the culmination of 12 years of patient preparation. James Mason, his organized network crumbling around him, made one last desperate move. Exactly, as Samuel had anticipated he would. "He's coming here," William reported from his observation post. 20 riders with him, his most loyal men. They're taking the north approach to your farm. Samuel stood on his porch, his posture relaxed, but his mind calculating every detail. Through the years of preparation, he had known this moment would come, when desperation would drive his opponent to direct confrontation. "Everyone in position?" he asked quietly through their communication system. "Sheriff Crawford's men are in place," Sarah confirmed. Dr. Matthews has his people covering every escape route. The federal marshal's forces are standing by, just beyond the ridge. Let's pause for a moment. If this final confrontation has you on edge, make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's part will reveal the shocking conclusion to Samuel's master plan. Thunder rolled across the valley as Mason's group approached. Their previous military discipline had given way to desperate aggression, but even now they were riding into a trap laid years before they'd ever entered the valley. "You've destroyed everything," Mason called out as they reached the farm, his voice carrying the bitter edge of defeated pride. "Years of preparation, all our careful work, ruined by a farmer." Samuel's response carried the quiet certainty of a master strategist. "No, James, not destroyed, documented. Every piece of your father's network, every attempt to rebuild it, every connection you tried to re-establish, all carefully preserved as evidence." Through the gathering storm, more riders appeared on the surrounding ridges, but these weren't gang reinforcements. Federal marshals, state law enforcement, and local deputies had positioned themselves precisely according to Samuel's long-prepared plans. "You're surrounded, James," Samuel continued softly. "Every escape route you might consider, every fallback, position you think you know, they're all covered, have been since before you entered the valley." Mason's face showed the dawning realization of just how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. This whole thing, the quiet farmer act, the years of passive resistance, it was all a trap? "Not just a trap," Samuel corrected. "A documentation project. Every move you made trying to rebuild your father's network helped us expose what remained of it. Your show of force here didn't just fail, it gave us everything we needed to dismantle operations across 4 states. Through their hidden observation posts, Samuel's network watched Mason's remaining men, starting to grasp the hopelessness of their position. The confident warriors who had terrorized the valley were now surrounded, their every potential move anticipated and countered years in advance. "Your father taught you strategy," Samuel continued, his voice carrying just far enough to reach every rider. "But he never learned the most important lesson of intelligence work. Sometimes the most effective weapon isn't force or cunning, it's patience, the willingness to spend years building an airtight case that no one can deny or escape." Lightning split the sky as Mason made his final desperate decision. His hand moved toward his weapon, but Samuel's voice stopped him cold. "Before you try it," the former spy said quietly, "look at your men's positions. Notice anything familiar about the terrain you're standing on?" Mason's eyes widened as he finally recognized the tactical pattern. "These are your father's favorite defensive formations," Samuel finished. "The same ones he taught his intelligence officers, the same ones we documented and countered during the war. You've positioned your men exactly where we planned for them to be, using tactics we've spent years preparing to defeat." Through the wind and rain, more law enforcement forces became visible on every approach. The trap wasn't just physical. It was strategic, psychological, and absolutely complete. "You could have just arrested us when we first arrived," Mason said, realization dawning. "Why all this elaborate preparation?" Samuel's slight smile carried decades of strategic satisfaction. "Because this wasn't just about stopping a gang, James. It was about exposing and documenting every surviving piece of your father's network, every safe house, every sympathizer, every cached resource you tried to access, all now proven and documented beyond any possibility of denial." The storm broke in full force as Mason finally understood the true scope of his defeat. His attempt to resurrect his father's legacy hadn't just failed. It had exposed every carefully preserved remnant of Confederate intelligence infrastructure that had survived the war. "Your choice now," Samuel concluded quietly. "Surrender and testify about everything you know, or face federal charges with the evidence we've spent 12 years gathering. Either way, the network ends here. Thunder punctuated his words as Mason looked around at his trapped men, at the overwhelming forces surrounding them, and at the quiet farmer who had orchestrated their complete defeat through years of patient preparation. The rain fell steadily as James Mason, son of a Confederate spy master, made the only choice left to him. His weapon dropped to the mud as federal agents moved in, and with his surrender, the last significant remnant of his father's intelligence network began its final collapse. Dawn broke over Willow Creek Valley the next morning to find a transformed landscape. Federal marshals and state law enforcement officers moved methodically through the area, securing evidence and arrested gang members. But the real transformation wasn't in the physical presence of law enforcement. It was in the revelation of just how thoroughly Samuel's patient preparation had dismantled a network decades in the making. Reports coming in from across 3 states, Crawford announced, entering Samuel's kitchen with fresh dispatches. 47 arrests so far, including major supporters we didn't even know about. Your documentation is leading them to connections we never suspected existed. Samuel sat at his familiar kitchen table, studying the latest intelligence, with the same careful attention he'd maintained through 12 years of observation. And James Mason? Talking, Sarah confirmed, bringing coffee to the gathered allies. Once he understood the scope of evidence we had, he realized his only choice was cooperation. His testimony is exposing operations even you hadn't documented. Let's pause for a moment. If this revelation of justice has captured your attention, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's part will show the full impact of Samuel's victory. Through their observation network, now operating openly, they watched as law enforcement systematically dismantled the gang's infrastructure. Every safe house Samuel had documented, every supply cache he'd mapped, every communication route he'd identified, all were being methodically secured and documented. Federal prosecutors are calling it unprecedented, William reported, reading from the latest telegram. The most comprehensive exposure of organized criminal infrastructure since the war. Your evidence doesn't just prove current crimes, it documents the evolution of their entire network over decades. Dr. Matthews arrived with news from his contacts in other territories. Similar operations are being exposed across the region. Every connection the Mason gang tried to reactivate led investigators to more hidden infrastructure. It's not just one network being dismantled, it's an entire hidden system dating back to the war. Samuel nodded slowly, examining maps where he'd marked decades of patient observation. Colonel Mason built something meant to survive the war's end, a network that could lie dormant until the right moment, then resurrect itself. His slight smile carried quiet satisfaction. He never considered that someone might spend years documenting every piece of it, waiting for just this moment. The federal marshal, who had arrived to coordinate the broader investigation, studied Samuel's documentation with professional appreciation. This is beyond anything we imagined. You haven't just provided evidence of current crimes. You've mapped out how these networks maintained themselves, how they preserved resources and connections across decades. Had to be thorough, Samuel replied simply. Wasn't enough to stop one gang or expose one operation. The whole system needed to be documented, every connection verified, every piece of evidence preserved beyond any possibility of denial. Through the morning, more reports arrived of the operation's expanding impact. James Mason's attempt to resurrect his father's network hadn't just failed. It had exposed decades of carefully preserved infrastructure that had survived in the shadows since the war's end. Got word from the governor's office, Crawford announced. They're establishing a special commission to investigate all the connections your evidence revealed. This goes beyond criminal activity. There are political implications they're just beginning to understand. Sarah's network of merchants and traders reported the ripple effects spreading through the region. Every community the gang tried to intimidate is coming forward now, sharing information about similar attempts in the past. Your documentation is giving people the courage to expose what they've known about for years. Samuel watched from his porch as federal agents carefully catalogued evidence from his root cellar. 12 years of patient observation, thousands of carefully preserved documents and records, all now serving their intended purpose. Colonel Mason always taught that information was power, he mused quietly. He never understood that the real power lies in knowing when and how to use it. The afternoon brought more revelations as James Mason's testimony continued. Each connection he exposed, each operation he detailed, fitted perfectly into the framework of evidence Samuel had spent years assembling. The quiet farmer's patient. Preparation had created an unassailable foundation that turned one gang leader's cooperation into a key that unlocked decades of hidden history. They're calling it the most significant law enforcement operation since the war, the federal marshal said, joining Samuel on the porch. But it's more than that, isn't it? This wasn't just about stopping criminals. It was about exposing and dismantling something that should have ended decades ago. Samuel's expression showed the quiet satisfaction of a master strategist, seeing years of patient preparation achieve their intended purpose. Some wounds from the war never properly healed, he replied softly. They just got hidden, preserved, by men who couldn't accept that their time had passed. Sometimes the only way to truly heal them is to expose everything to the light. As evening approached, the valley began to settle into a new kind of peace. Not just the absence of threat, but the profound calm that comes from knowing that deep-rooted problems have finally been exposed and addressed. Samuel's patient preparation hadn't just stopped a gang. It had helped bring closure to wounds that had festered since the Civil War's end. A week after James Mason's surrender, Willow Creek Valley had begun a transformation that went far beyond the mere absence of threat. The community that had come together under Samuel's quiet guidance emerged stronger, more unified, with a deeper understanding of their own capabilities. The changes were evident not just in restored buildings and reopened roads, but in the way people carried themselves, with the confidence of those who had faced a serious threat and overcome it through unity and preparation. Hard to believe. How much has changed, Sarah remarked, serving coffee to the regular morning gathering at her store. The former command center had become a natural meeting place for townspeople sharing news of the ongoing investigations and arrests. 23 more arrests yesterday, William reported, reading from the latest dispatch. Every connection James Mason reveals leads to more hidden infrastructure. Your documentation is helping them uncover operations in places we never suspected. Samuel listened quietly, noting how his neighbors now discussed intelligence matters and strategic thinking with the ease of experienced operators. The skills he'd carefully cultivated in them hadn't faded with the immediate threat's end. Let's pause for a moment. If this story of transformation intrigues you, subscribe now, because tomorrow's part will reveal the lasting impact of Samuel's legacy. Got word from the federal marshal's office? Crawford added, joining them with fresh reports. They're using your methods now, teaching other communities how to recognize and document suspicious patterns. Your 12 years of preparation have become a template for law enforcement across the region. Through the town, signs of renewal were everywhere. The burned barns were being rebuilt, but with subtle improvements Samuel had suggested. Better sightlines, more defensible positions, hidden observation posts that looked like ordinary architectural features. The community wasn't just recovering, it was evolving. The Governor's Commission arrives tomorrow, Dr. Matthews announced. They want to understand exactly how we managed to expose and document such an extensive network. Seems other regions are facing similar challenges. Samuel nodded, understanding the broader implications. The Mason gang wasn't unique. There are other organizations out there, other networks trying to preserve pieces of the past that should have ended with the war. What we learned here, how we prepared and responded, it can help other communities face similar threats. Sarah's store had become more than just a merchant's establishment. Her careful system of tracking purchases and monitoring unusual patterns had caught the attention of law enforcement agencies. They were now studying her methods, recognizing how simple commerce could become a sophisticated intelligence-gathering tool. 3 more communities have requested our documentation protocols, she reported. They are seeing similar patterns in their regions, starting to recognize signs they missed before. William's freight company, too, had evolved. His drivers now understood how to observe and document suspicious movements, how to recognize patterns that might indicate organized criminal activity. The skills Samuel had taught them were being integrated into their daily operations. It's not just about stopping threats, Samuel explained to the gathered townspeople. It's about building communities that can recognize and respond to them effectively. The best defense isn't just force or weapons, it's awareness, preparation, and unity. Through the week, more evidence emerged of how thoroughly Samuel's patient preparation had transformed the region. The federal marshal's investigation had expanded to 5 states, each new arrest revealing more connections to networks that had survived since the war. Your documentation method is becoming standard procedure, Crawford reported. They're calling it the Thorne Protocol, systematic observation and recording of suspicious patterns over extended periods. Seems you've changed more than just our valley. Dr. Matthews shared reports from his medical colleagues in other towns. Communities are starting to understand that defense isn't just about guns and guards. It's about creating networks of aware citizens, people trained to recognize and document suspicious activities. Samuel watched these developments from his familiar porch, seeing how his years of careful preparation had sparked changes he hadn't fully anticipated. The quiet farmer's methods hadn't just stopped one gang, they had provided a template for communities facing similar challenges. The railway companies implementing new security protocols, William announced, based on your documentation methods. They're training staff to recognize and record suspicious patterns, teaching them how to build evidence properly. Sarah's network of merchants had expanded, connecting with shops and traders across the region. They shared information about unusual purchases, suspicious inquiries, patterns that might indicate organized criminal activity. The simple communication system Samuel had developed was evolving into something more sophisticated. As evening approached, Samuel sat at his kitchen table, reviewing reports of how his methods were being adapted and implemented in other communities. The quiet farmer's patient preparation had created something that would outlast the immediate victory, a new way of thinking about community defense and security. You've given people more than just safety, Crawford observed, joining him. You've shown them how to be strong in ways that don't depend on force, how to build communities that can protect themselves through awareness and preparation. Samuel's slight smile carried the satisfaction of seeing his work bear unexpected fruit. Sometimes the best legacy isn't just solving a problem, he replied quietly. It's teaching others how to prevent similar problems from taking root in the first place. A month after the Mason gang's defeat, Willow Creek Valley had become something few could have imagined, a model for communities across the nation facing similar challenges. Representatives from towns in 5 states had arrived to study what Samuel dubbed patient resistance, learning how quiet preparation and unified community action could overcome even the most determined threats. Another delegation arriving from Virginia today, Sarah reported during the morning gathering at her store, which had evolved into an informal training center. They're facing similar attempts to revive old networks in their region, want to learn how we documented and exposed the patterns. Samuel sat in his usual spot, watching how his neighbors had transformed from simple townspeople into skilled instructors, each sharing the specific aspects of resistance they'd mastered under his guidance. Let's pause for a moment. If this legacy of transformation interests you, subscribe now, because tomorrow's part will reveal how Samuel's methods begin changing communities across the nation. It's spreading faster than we expected, William added, reviewing correspondence from other communities. Every town that implements your methods seems to discover similar hidden networks. Your 12 years of preparation have become a blueprint for exposing decades of concealed criminal infrastructure. Dr. Matthews shared reports from his medical colleagues across 3 states. They're finding the same patterns you documented. Here, old Confederate intelligence routes being quietly reactivated, criminal organizations hiding behind legitimate businesses, corruption preserved through generations. Through the town, evidence of lasting transformation was everywhere. The rebuilt barns now incorporated subtle defensive features that looked like ordinary architectural elements. Sarah's store maintained its careful system of tracking unusual purchases and patterns. Williams' freight company had developed sophisticated methods for monitoring and documenting suspicious movements. Federal investigators are calling it a revolution in community defense, Crawford reported. Your methods of patient observation and documentation are being incorporated into law enforcement training across the country. They're teaching deputies how to build cases the way you did, slowly, methodically, irrefutably. Samuel listened to these reports with quiet satisfaction, understanding that his years of preparation had created something far beyond just defending one valley. The biggest threat was never just the criminal activities, he explained to a gathered group of visiting lawmen. It was the networks that supported them, hidden infrastructure preserved since the war, connecting multiple states through secret routes and loyal supporters. Through their now expanded observation network, reports arrived daily of more operations being exposed. Each community that adopted Samuel's methods seemed to uncover its own hidden networks, its own carefully preserved criminal infrastructure dating back to the war's end. Got word from the Governor's Commission, Crawford announced. They're establishing a permanent task force based on your protocols. Every county will have trained observers using your documentation methods to track suspicious patterns and build cases. Sarah's merchant network had grown into a sophisticated intelligence-gathering system spanning multiple states. It's not just about watching for criminals anymore, she explained to visiting shopkeepers. It's about understanding patterns, recognizing when seemingly innocent activities might indicate larger organized efforts. Samuel spent his mornings on his porch as usual, but now he often had company, lawmen, community leaders, and ordinary citizens seeking to understand how quiet observation and patient preparation could transform their own towns. The key, he explained to one such group, isn't just gathering information, it's understanding how separate pieces connect, how small patterns can reveal larger organizations. Most importantly, it's about building communities that can recognize and respond to threats without losing their essential character. Williams' freight company had become a model for transportation security across the region. Every driver knows what to watch for now, he explained. Not just obvious suspicious activity, but subtle patterns that might indicate organized operations. They understand how small observations, properly documented, can help expose larger networks. Dr. Matthews coordinated with medical professionals throughout the territory, sharing methods for recognizing and documenting patterns that might indicate criminal activity. Healthcare providers see things others miss, he noted. Samuel taught us how to turn those observations into actionable intelligence without compromising medical ethics. As evening approached, Samuel reviewed reports from communities implementing his methods. Each success story confirmed that his patient approach to resistance could work anywhere people were willing to put in the time and effort to prepare properly. You've created more than just a defense strategy, Crawford observed. You've shown people how to build stronger communities by working together, by staying aware and united. That's a legacy that will outlast any single victory. Through the valley, signs of permanent transformation were everywhere. The community hadn't just survived a threat. It had evolved into something stronger, more resilient, more capable of protecting itself through awareness and unity, rather than force alone. Sometimes, Samuel told his gathered neighbors, the most effective resistance isn't about confrontation or violence. It's about patient preparation, about building communities so strong and aware that threats can't take root in the first place. That's the real victory. Not just stopping one gang, but creating a model that can prevent similar threats from emerging anywhere. 2 months after the Mason gang's defeat, Willow Creek Valley hosted a gathering that would have been unimaginable just weeks before. Representatives from 6 states converged on the small community to witness the formal establishment of what was being called the Sentinel Network, a coordinated system of community defense based on Samuel's methods of patient observation and documentation. 57 communities have already implemented your protocols, William reported during the morning briefing. Each one is uncovering evidence of hidden networks, criminal infrastructure that's survived since the war. Your methods aren't just exposing current threats. They're helping dismantle decades of concealed operations. Samuel sat in his customary place at Sarah's store, now transformed into a regional coordination center, watching how his neighbors had evolved from students into teachers of his methods. Let's pause for a moment. If this expansion of justice intrigues you, subscribe now, because tomorrow's part will reveal how Samuel's legacy begins reshaping law enforcement across the nation. The Federal Marshal's Office is adopting your documentation system as standard procedure, Crawford announced, sharing the latest official communications. They're calling it persistent surveillance, the art of patient, methodical observation and evidence gathering over extended periods. Through the valley, evidence of permanent transformation was everywhere. Sarah's merchant network had expanded to include shops and traders across multiple states, all sharing information about suspicious patterns using Samuel's carefully designed protocols. It's not just about watching for obvious threats anymore, she explained to a group of visiting storekeepers. It's about understanding how small details connect to larger patterns, how seemingly innocent activities might indicate organized operations when properly documented over time. Dr. Matthews coordinated with medical professionals throughout the territory, implementing Samuel's methods of recognizing and recording suspicious patterns without compromising patient confidentiality. Healthcare providers are often the first to notice signs of organized criminal activity, he noted. Samuel taught us how to transform those observations into actionable intelligence. Latest reports from Virginia, William added, reviewing fresh dispatches. 3 more hidden networks exposed using your methods, each one connected to infrastructure dating back to the war. Your patient approach is helping communities uncover things that have been concealed for generations. Samuel listened to these reports with quiet satisfaction, understanding that his years of preparation had created something far beyond defending one valley. The real threat was never just the visible criminals, he explained to the gathered representatives. It was The hidden support systems, the carefully preserved networks that allowed them to operate. That's what patient observation helps expose, not just current activities, but the entire infrastructure behind them. Through their expanded observation network, reports arrive daily of more operations being uncovered. Each community that adopted Samuel's methods seemed to discover its own hidden networks, its own carefully maintained criminal infrastructure that had survived since the war's end. The Governor's Commission has formalized your protocols, Crawford reported. Every county will have trained observers using your documentation methods. They're creating a permanent system based on your years of preparation. Sarah's store had become a model for merchant-based intelligence gathering across the region. It's about building networks of aware citizens, she explained to visiting shopkeepers. People who understand how to recognize and document suspicious patterns without disrupting normal community life. The transformation of Willow Creek Valley itself continued to evolve. The rebuilt barns now incorporated subtle defensive features that looked like ordinary architectural elements. Williams Freight Company had developed sophisticated methods for monitoring and documenting suspicious movements. Every aspect of community life had been enhanced by Samuel's teachings without losing its essential character. You've shown us that true security doesn't come from force, Crawford observed, watching the valley's daily activities. It comes from awareness, preparation, and community unity. That's a lesson that's spreading far beyond our borders. But through the afternoon, Samuel met with various groups of visitors, each seeking to understand how his methods could be adapted to their own communities. The key, he explained repeatedly, is patience. Quick responses might stop immediate threats, but patient observation helps prevent future ones. As evening approached, reports continued arriving of more communities adopting his methods, more hidden networks being exposed, more long-concealed criminal infrastructure being dismantled. Each success story confirmed that Samuel's approach to community defense could work anywhere people were willing to invest the time and effort to prepare properly. What you've created here, the federal marshal told him, goes beyond law enforcement. You've shown communities how to protect themselves through awareness and unity rather than force alone. That's a legacy that will continue growing long after any single victory. Samuel watched the sun setting over his valley, understanding that his years of quiet preparation had sparked changes he hadn't fully anticipated. The patient former spy had created not just a defense strategy, but a new way of thinking about community security that was spreading across the nation. Sometimes, he told his gathered neighbors, the most effective resistance isn't about confrontation. It's about patient preparation, about building communities so strong and aware that threats can't take root. That's the real victory. Not just stopping one gang, but creating a model that can prevent similar threats from emerging anywhere. 3 months after the Mason gang's defeat, Samuel sat in his familiar spot on the farmhouse porch, reviewing reports that showed just how far his influence had spread. The quiet farmer, who had spent 12 years preparing to protect one valley, had unknowingly created a movement that was transforming communities across the nation. Final numbers from the federal marshal's office, Crawford announced, joining him with fresh dispatches. 237 arrests across 8 states. 14 major criminal networks exposed. 43 corrupt officials identified, all stemming from evidence you gathered and methods you developed. Sarah arrived with coffee and her latest intelligence summaries. The store owner, who had once simply tracked unusual purchases, was now coordinating a sophisticated network of merchant observers spanning multiple states. Let's pause for a moment. If this tale of transformation has captured your interest, subscribe now, because tomorrow's final part will reveal Samuel's ultimate legacy. James Mason's testimony continues to yield results, she reported. Every connection he reveals leads investigators to more hidden infrastructure. Your documentation methods are helping them uncover operations that have been concealed for decades. Through the valley, signs of permanent transformation were everywhere. The community that had come together under Samuel's guidance had evolved into something remarkable, a living example of how patient preparation and unity could overcome any threat. Got word from the governor's office, William added, joining them. They're establishing a permanent training center here. Want to teach your methods to law enforcement and community leaders from across the country. The Sentinel network is becoming official policy. Samuel listened quietly, remembering the long years of preparation that had led to this moment. The real victory, he observed, isn't in what we stopped, but in what we've started. Communities learning to protect themselves through awareness and unity rather than force. Dr. Matthews arrived with reports from his expanded medical network. 3 more states have adopted your protocols for healthcare providers, he announced, teaching medical professionals how to recognize and document patterns without compromising patient care. Your methods are changing how entire professions approach community security. Through their observation network, now spanning multiple states, reports continued flowing in of more operations being exposed. Each community that implemented Samuel's methods seemed to discover its own hidden networks, its own carefully preserved criminal infrastructure dating back to the war. The federal marshal says it's unprecedented, Crawford noted, not just the number of arrests, but the quality of evidence being gathered. Communities using your methods are building cases that can't be denied or dismissed. Sarah's store had become a model for merchant-based intelligence gathering across the nation. We're teaching shopkeepers in 5 states now, she explained, showing them how to transform routine business observations into valuable intelligence without disrupting normal commerce. The valley itself stood as testament to the effectiveness of Samuel's approach. The rebuilt barns incorporated subtle defensive features that looked like ordinary architectural elements. Williams Freight Company had developed sophisticated methods for monitoring and documenting suspicious movements. Every aspect of community life had been enhanced by Samuel's teachings without losing its essential character. You've created something remarkable, the federal marshal observed during his latest visit. Not just a defense strategy, but a new way of thinking about community security. These methods will be protecting towns long after we're gone. Through the afternoon, Samuel met with various groups of visitors, each seeking to understand how his methods could be adapted to their own communities. The key, he explained repeatedly, is understanding that true security comes from patient preparation and community unity, not just force or weapons. As evening approached, more reports arrived of communities implementing his methods, more hidden networks being exposed, more long-concealed criminal infrastructure being dismantled. Each success story confirmed that Samuel's approach to resistance could work anywhere people were willing to invest the time and effort to prepare properly. What you've given us, Crawford reflected, watching the sunset over their transformed valley, goes beyond just security. You've shown us how communities can protect themselves while united. That will any single victory. Samuel stood on his porch, surveying the valley he'd chosen 12 years ago. The quiet farmer's patient preparation had created something far beyond what he'd initially planned. Not just a defense against one threat, but a model for communities facing similar challenges across the nation. Sometimes, he told his gathered neighbors, the most effective resistance isn't about confrontation or force. It's about patient preparation, about building communities so strong and aware that threats can't take root. That's the real victory, not just stopping one gang, but creating a way for communities everywhere to protect themselves through unity and awareness. As night fell over Willow Creek Valley, Samuel reflected on how his years of quiet preparation had sparked changes he hadn't fully anticipated. The patient former spy had created not just a defense strategy, but a new way of thinking about community security that would continue spreading long after any single threat was overcome. 6 months after the Mason gang's defeat, Samuel returned to his farm after attending a special ceremony in Washington, D.C., where the Thorne Protocols had been officially adopted as national policy for community defense. The quiet farmer, who had spent 12 years preparing to protect one valley, had transformed how an entire nation thought about security and justice. "Final report from the Federal Commission," Crawford announced, meeting him at the farm with fresh dispatches. Over 500 arrests across 12 states. 23 major criminal networks dismantled, 67 corrupt officials removed from office, all stemming from your methods and the evidence you gathered. Sarah joined them, bringing coffee and her latest intelligence summaries. The simple store owner had become a recognized expert in community-based observation networks, teaching her methods to merchants across the country. "James Mason's testimony concluded yesterday," she reported. "His cooperation helped expose the last remnants of his father's network. But more importantly, communities everywhere are using your methods to prevent similar organizations from taking root." Through the valley, the signs of permanent transformation were evident everywhere. The community that had come together under Samuel's guidance had become something remarkable, a living example of how patient preparation and unity could overcome any threat and create lasting change. "The training center's expanding again," William added, arriving with news from town. "Representatives from 3 more states arriving next week. Everyone wants to learn the quiet way of fighting back. Your methods are changing how people think about defending their communities." Samuel sat in his familiar spot on the porch, remembering the long years of preparation that had led to this moment. "The real victory," he observed, "isn't in what we stopped, but in what we've started. Communities learning that true strength comes from patience, preparation, and unity." Dr. Matthews arrived with reports from the national medical network he now coordinated. "Your protocols have been adopted by healthcare systems in 15 states, he announced, teaching medical professionals how to recognize and document patterns while maintaining their ethical obligations. You've changed how entire professions approach community security. Through their observation network, now spanning much of the nation, reports continued flowing in of more communities successfully implementing Samuel's methods. Each success story confirmed that patient resistance could work anywhere. People were willing to invest the time and effort to prepare properly. "The federal marshal says it's unprecedented," Crawford noted. "Not just the number of criminals being caught, but how communities are preventing threats from taking root in the first place. Your methods are stopping problems before they can grow." Sarah's store had become a national model for merchant-based intelligence gathering. "We're teaching shopkeepers in every state now," she explained, showing them how to transform routine business observations into valuable intelligence while maintaining normal community life. The valley itself stood as testament to the effectiveness of Samuel's approach. Every aspect of community life had been enhanced by his teachings without losing its essential character. The rebuilt barns incorporated subtle defensive features that looked like ordinary architectural elements. Williams Freight Company had developed sophisticated methods for monitoring and documenting suspicious movements. "You've created something that will outlast all of us," the federal marshal observed during his final visit. "Not just a defense strategy, but a new way of thinking about community security. These methods will be protecting towns long after we're gone." As evening approached, Samuel stood on his porch one last time, surveying the valley he'd chosen 12 years ago. The quiet farmer's patient preparation had created something far beyond what he'd initially planned, not just a defense against one threat, but a model for communities facing similar challenges across the nation. Sometimes, he told his gathered neighbors, the most effective resistance isn't about confrontation or force. It's about patient preparation, about building communities so strong and aware that threats can't take root. That's the real victory, not just stopping one gang, but creating a way for communities everywhere to protect themselves through unity and awareness. Through the valley, lights began twinkling on in homes and businesses. Each light represented not just a building, but a point of awareness in a network that now extended far beyond their small community. Samuel's patient preparation had created something that would continue growing and evolving long after any single victory was forgotten. What you've given us, Crawford reflected, watching the sunset paint the valley in golden hues, goes beyond just security. You've shown us how communities can protect themselves while growing stronger, more united. That's a legacy that will keep working long after we're gone. As night fell over Willow Creek Valley one last time, Samuel thought about the long journey that had brought him here. The quiet farmer's patience had created not just a defense strategy, but a new way of thinking about community security that would continue spreading across the nation, protecting communities through unity, awareness, and careful preparation rather than force alone. The former spy, who had spent 12 years preparing to protect one valley, had unknowingly created a movement that would transform countless communities for generations to come. And in that transformation lay the true power of patient resistance. Not just in stopping threats, but in building something stronger and more lasting in their place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.